Chapter 12. That evening when Tim had finished working over the big, black wood-burning stove, he went to the Navy kitchen to have some food with Devil and Belle. He looked down mournfully at his greasy pants. When Devil finished eating, he turned to Tim. "You're downcast tonight, Lieutenant," he said, pulling at his long nose. Tim knew by now that he could trust the Navy men. "I have to get away from here," he whispered. "Red and I are dying to get away." Devil was sitting on a barrel and Belle squatted on an empty wooden box. Belle doused his empty plate in a pail of water and put it on the table. He held his hands over his knees and cracked his knuckles. "Are you more anxious than the rest?" "Some others are anxious, too, of course." Belle got up from the box. He reached into a corner and brought out a copy of a Charleston paper only 2 weeks old. "Auntie brought me this a few days ago." He unfolded the paper and pointed to a column that, 98, was headlined "Present Position of Union Troops. Sherman's in Memphis now. And Burnside's been in Knoxville since early September." Tim said, "Knoxville's closer by some 300 miles. But granting that we'd have a chance to get to Burnside's lines, how will we get away from here?" Devil stood up and walked to the door. When he was satisfied that none of the guards was near, he crossed the little room and pulled aside a couple of ragged towels that hung across a corner on a piece of string. A big rusty boiler was there. "Look here," he said, pointing at the wall behind the boiler. There was a small, sashless window halfway up the wall. "That leads to the woodshed, doesn't it?" "It does," said Devil, "and the fence at the back of the woodshed happens to be in sorry shape. If a man could find a time to do a little work, he could loosen a board in the fence." Belle was keeping watch in the doorway. He turned around to speak to Tim. "The boards of the fence are wide, and the nails were hammered in from outside." Tim's heart thumped as thoughts of escape whirled through his mind. Forgetting himself, he spoke with excitement. "One of us could loosen a board while we were fetching wood." A couple of blows with a decent-sized log. Belle turned around again, this time with his forefinger pressed against his mouth. Then he sauntered to the center of the room. "They'll hear you, if you aren't careful." A guard put his head in the door. "The corporal says, finish your chores," he drawled. "He wants to take you back inside." Tim grinned foolishly at the guard, stood up and went, 99, around to the army kitchen. His hands shook as he lit the lantern and scraped the stove. He signaled a sentry who was lighting the lamp that hung in a bracket on the jailhouse wall. "Finished for today," he said. Addison's room was on the first floor at the back of the jail, and when the guard knocked, the corporal's keys began to rattle. He opened the door. "'Bout time," he said, holding his lantern so it would light Tim's face. As they moved along the first-floor corridor, Addison mumbled, "I'm going up too." It was the custom of Sen or the guard on duty to check the prisoners' beds after the men came up from their mess. Sen had decreed that they stay on their beds until he'd finished counting them in. Tim went straight to his cell and climbed to his bunk. Red lay on the top bunk, across from Tim. He stirred against the dingy wall. "Sure, that was a capital mush you cooked tonight." "Sit up," Tim said. "I've got to talk to you." "What is it, boy?" Tim slapped his thigh. "We have it," he whispered. "We have a route at last." "You've marked it on the map?" asked Red. Addison's keys jingled in the hall. "No, I'll tell you later." Bullheads coming down the hall. Addison's boots scuffed out of the adjoining cell and he appeared in the doorway with his lantern held high. He looked at Tim with something like a smile. "We meet again," he said. Dawson's arm was dangling from his bunk. The man was apparently asleep. 100, Addison squinted at the bunk under Tim's. "Is Lieutenant Mills in that pile of straw?" Mills' voice came from the corridor. "Sorry I'm not on my bunk," he said, "but I had duties at the end of the hall." "Now what duties?" Addison began, then stammered, "Try not to let it happen again." He moved past Mills and along the hall. Red doubled up with glee. "Never again," he said as he rolled over and shook his bunk with silent laughter. Tim smiled to himself. "They say if you stay in jail too long you go back to your childhood ways. We'll have to get you out of here." When Addison had left the floor, Tim and Red went to the end of the corridor away from the common room and stood by a window that overlooked the yard. The light from a flickering lamp outside painted swift black ghosts against the wall. Tim told Red about the window in the Navy kitchen and the condition of the fence at the back of the woodshed. "We can enter the kitchen when we're in the yard and crawl through the window while Devil and Belle kick up a noise. Then we'll wait in the woodshed till after dark. They'll discover our absence when they check the beds, and the hounds will be after us in no time at all. We might leave dummies in our beds." Red looked through the bars at the dark blue sky. "If Sen's not on duty, dummies might work. Sen's off duty all day Thursday. Let's aim for Thursday afternoon." "That soon?" "Why not? I'm sick of waiting. That gives us long enough to get ready." 101. By Wednesday night it seemed to Tim that nothing could go wrong. Yesterday afternoon Devil had loosened the boards in the fence. Tim had watched and listened from the corridor window when the wagon had come in. Auntie had cackled and slapped her thighs. She had prodded Belle to laughter with a set of faces that would have made a dying man laugh. There had been a bad moment when one of the guards, not satisfied with watching from his usual distance, had moved up to the woodshed door. "Don't fetch wood now," he'd said. "Wait until the wagon leaves." "Need wood now," Devil had said, staggering through the door with a teetering load. Then he'd tripped on the sill and the wood had gone flying, one piece hitting the guard on the shin, making him shout out a stream of oaths. Devil had kicked the shed door shut before he got off the ground. Tim hoped that no one passing through the alley would notice the loosened board and report it to Sen. Tim stood by the window in the common room. He watched Red bending over his game of chess with Peter Mills and marveled at his outward calm. A little fire sputtered on the hearth and Dawson and Fraser were reading by candlelight. Brown stood in the door, staring into the fire and dreaming his private dreams. The air outside was clear as crystal, and the lights twinkled yellow in the neat white houses. A soldier and a girl passed under a lamp at the corner of the park. Kate's map had shown him the rail line running north along the east bank of the Broad, sticking pretty close to the river for a number of miles. That was their route, straight up the Broad. God give them the night time to move without pursuit. 102. Now the sound of music reached his ears. Tim had heard it before. It was said that the people of Columbia held great balls from time to time to raise money for the armies of the Confederacy. For a moment Tim forgot the meager rations in the jail, the smells, the dirty clothes, the bedbugs that plagued them at night, the eternal boredom that made the men short of temper. He thought of the people he would miss. There were Devil and Belle and Peter Mills. Tim's thoughts went back to a late afternoon shortly after the arrival of the officers captured in the second assault. Someone had started to sing the Star-Spangled Banner, others had joined the singer, and before a minute had passed the whole second floor had rocked with the song. The prisoners had pressed against the bars and shouted across the town. Suddenly, caught by the sun, a white handkerchief had fluttered from a window of the little white house across the street. Then the owner of the handkerchief had appeared, a happy-faced young woman who waved as if she could never grow tired. Sen and Bullhead and another guard had come up the stairs to spoil the fun. Sen didn't want singing or shouting in his jail. But from that time on the young woman whose heart beat for the Union had been the sweetheart of every Yankee in the jail. Tim thought again of the coming day. 2 haversacks and some other supplies were hidden in the Navy kitchen. Tim put his hand over his breast pocket to be sure that his pictures were there. They had come in a shining black book with the word album stamped in gold on its spine. The covers were sky blue inside, neatly patterned with white stars. The pages were made of heavy pasteboard covered with paper frames to hold the pictures. The frames were arched at the top and lined around with gold. 103. Kate's picture was there with the ones of mother and father and the twins. It was the only one that wasn't stiff. It was posed, of course, but somehow Kate's natural poise made it seem more alive. Her waist was slim and her figure had filled out where it should be full. She was more of a woman now. The photographer had put a touch too much pink on the cheeks, but her face was the same. Before the picture had come, her face had faded a little from Tim's mind. Now he could see her clear as yesterday. She had cut out a little piece from the hem of the dress she wore in the picture and had pasted it on the blank page opposite her photograph. The material was golden brown, some kind of silk he supposed it was. The fire flickered low. Tim heard the men stirring behind him and felt a hand on his shoulder. "No sleep tomorrow night," Red said quietly. "We better get sleep while we can." Tim turned from the window. "We've rested for 5 months now. We don't need sleep. We need a beefsteak dinner and a couple of greatcoats." Dawson looked up from his book, quiet and inscrutable. "Do you really mean to try to escape?" By now their secret was known to everyone on the second floor. There had been the chance that someone would notice their absence from the mess. Then, too, they would need a little help along the way. Mills' chess partner had left the room and Mills was studying the board. He turned to Dawson. "Sure they're going," he said. "Say, Dawson, do you play chess?" Dawson didn't answer, and Mills stood up and followed Red and Tim out the door and along the corridor. When they were back in their room, Mills said, "That man's behavior is downright unsettling." 104, they lay down on their bunks, and after a while Dawson came in and stretched out on his bunk, without taking off his blouse. Soon he breathed steadily in a seesaw chorus with Mills. Tim thought again about Kate's map. She must have searched her soul before she mailed it. That map, drawn with such painstaking care, might show him the way to his death. But she must have known he would never rest until he'd tried to get away. Until now Kate had been waiting at the end of the trail, warm and lovely but far away. All at once it seemed she was very close, her faith and understanding sending him on his way, making him impatient to be free, no matter what hardships freedom might bring. Red stirred, and Tim whispered, "Red, you awake?" "Yes. Wish Peter could go along." "So do I. You got any worries?" "Not really. Good night, lad." 105, Chapter 13, After breakfast some of the prisoners gathered in the common room. Red's calm began to disappear. As soon as Addison left the floor, Red pulled a list from his side pocket. He and Tim went over it one last time. 6 quarts of corn, parched and ground, were waiting in the Navy kitchen. Extra woolen underclothes and socks, a paper of salt for each of them, a piece of soap, some lucifer matches and tin cups. These things were packed into the haversacks concealed behind the boiler in the kitchen. Toothbrushes, family photographs and such can go in our pockets. Tim said. That just leaves blankets. Red gave the paper one last look, then tore it up and threw the scraps on the ashes from the night before, turning them under with the toe of his boot. Mills asked, "When will you set the dummies up?" Red said, "It can't be now, or 2 of us will be in our stocking feet all day." A man named Allen leaned against the wall by the door. "I have an extra pair of boots," he said. "They're no good for wearing, but you're welcome to them if they'll be of use." Mills' good blanket, his boots, and an extra blouse, 106, would be used to make the dummy on Tim's bunk. There was one spare blanket, ragged and full of holes. They would tear it in two. Mills would cover himself with half and they would use the other half for Red's bunk, with Allen's boots and an extra pair of pants stuffed with dirty clothes. Mills leaned against the chimney, his thin wrists and long hands sticking out from his tattered blouse. His face was pale but not so thin as it had been when Tim had first seen him slumped to the floor in this same room. His spirit had mended somehow. Mills looked at Tim with a faint familiar humor in his face. "I could never make a trip like that, you know." He measured the thickness of his thigh with his bony hands. "I have nothing in reserve." "You can make it in the spring," Tim said. Mills gave no sign of having heard. "I'll miss you boys." Dawson's figure appeared in the doorway and he managed a thin, one-sided smile. He looked toward Mills. "You promised to teach me chess. Remember, Mills?" Mills perked up a little. "Why sure I will." Red had a gold-plated watch. Until a week or so ago he had lost the habit of winding it. Keeping track of time had only made the hours drag. Now he kept it wound and fussed if it was slow or fast. He set it by a watch that Devil carried, He reached into his pocket and pulled out the watch and twiddled with the chain. I wish we had something to do. Curse all our early preparations. Fraser snickered. Never dreamed I'd see Kelly in a state like this. Red looked at his watch and put it back again. I just remembered I'm to be on slop duty today. I never thought I'd look forward to washing out those pails. 107, Tim said, don't get into trouble out there. At 10 o'clock Addison came up with 3 other guards. He asked for a couple of extra men to go down to the yard for wood. Tim almost leaped to his feet but he restrained himself. I'll go, Corporal, he said in what he hoped would pass for a casual tone. Do you want to come? Alan? Do you feel like toting some wood? At the midday meal Addison stood by the mess room door. Tim tried to see the room through the eyes of a guard. 2 men might not be missed tonight. He took a sip of water from his tin cup and bent low over his corncakes and sorghum molasses. Mills was just behind Dawson as the column moved upstairs. When they reached the landing Dawson leaned toward Addison and said a few words. Addison mumbled a reply. When Addison started back downstairs Tim averted his eyes until he heard the clang of the lower door. When he looked up again Mills had grasped the front of Dawson's blouse. He swung the man around and knocked him against the wall with a sickening sound. Mills had always been a gentleman. This action took everyone by surprise. The other men gaped while Mills slapped a hand over Dawson's mouth. Why did you ask to see Sen? Dawson's eyes bugged out as they fixed on Mills. Mills signaled with his head for Tim and Red to move in close, and dragged the man through the common room door. Dawson let out a little scream as Mills' hand slipped away from his mouth for a second. Mills shoved him into a corner. Tim and Fraser moved with Red and Alan to the center of the room. The others stood outside the door. Fraser brought out a knife that no one had ever known he had, a wicked thing with a gleaming, pointed blade. 108, Dawson twitched like a headless chicken on a chopping block. Mills held one hand behind Dawson's neck and the other firmly over his mouth. Red looked quietly down at Dawson and shook his head sadly. Tim kneeled. Dawson's breath came in violent gasps. Dawson, Tim said, Peter will take his hand away now and you won't cry out. Do you understand? Dawson's eyes lost their death-like stare. He slumped. Mills supported him almost gently now. Dawson nodded and Mills took his hand away. Tim spoke softly. Why did you want to speak to Sen? Dawson gave a quick little sigh and stared down at the splintering floor. The room was silent. Tim heard footsteps in the hall downstairs. Dawson raised his head as if to speak. But Tim signaled for quiet, and Dawson looked down like a feverish child. Addison's voice came up the stairs. What's all that knocking about up there? Red called, Indian wrestling. Want to come up and try your hand? Addison grunted and moved away. Well, Dawson, said Tim. Dawson's voice came high and thin. Mills heard me wrong. Mills took a fresh grip on Dawson's blouse. I heard you clear, he said. You'll get the knife if you don't tell us straight what was in your mind. Dawson collapsed, his body shaken by shuddering, racking sobs. Mills eased him to the floor, and Fraser struck out with his hand and tore off one of Dawson's shoulder straps with its captain's bars outlined in threadbare, greenish gold. You're not fit to carry a private slop, he said. Dawson grasped at his shoulder as if he'd been stabbed. 109, Tim said, all right now, Fraser. Let me talk to him. Tim looked into Dawson's eyes. If you give me your word you won't tell anyone about our plan. Now or any other time, I promise not to leave this jail till every prisoner has sworn that you'll come to no harm. Dawson said thinly, why should I strike a bargain with you? I'm not bargaining, Tim said evenly. I'm giving you a chance to save your skin. Dawson lowered his eyes. His lower lip quivered and he looked up at Tim, then down again. You have my word. Mills and Tim got to their feet and left the room. The others followed, leaving Dawson alone on the floor. Halfway down the corridor Mills turned to Tim. I better watch Dawson from now until tomorrow morning. The other men crowded around, and Fraser said, "I'll watch him too." "One man is enough," Mills said. "I'll go back and talk to him." Tim's hands trembled as he hacked the old blanket in half with Fraser's knife. That business with Dawson had shaken him up. Sen had said that an extra hand could go to the kitchen to do the wash and help with the chores. It seemed that all they'd had to do was ask. Now it should be easy to smuggle the blankets into the yard. Tim fetched the wooden laundry buckets. He and Red stripped their bunks and folded their blankets, squashing them into the bottoms of the buckets and covering them with a scattering of dirty underclothes they had rounded up from the men along the corridor. At 4 o'clock Addison and another guard trudged up the stairs. Red took one bucket and Alan the other. Tim, 110, looked over the room for the last time. A few deft motions of Mills's skillful hands and the blankets and boots and scraps of clothing would convince the unsuspecting Addison. For the 100th time Tim slapped the pocket where he kept Kate's map, and heard the reassuring crinkle. At the end of the corridor Peter Mills stood close to Dawson. When Addison saw the buckets he ordered the men to halt. "You can't do your washing now," he said. Red said, "The stuff's dirty. We want it to soak." "Soak it up here." Tim broke in. "Captain Sen gave us permission to take it to the yard." "Well, bring it along," Addison mumbled. Devil lounged in the Navy kitchen door, picking his teeth with a splinter of wood. Alan and Red set the buckets by the door. As they started their walk Tim studied the guards. Except for the tall young private, they certainly were a sorry lot. Mills and Dawson stood with a knot of men watching a game of dice the prisoners had started near the cookhouse wall. It seemed to Tim that familiar things weren't familiar anymore. The barred windows in the jailhouse wall, the lamp, the sentries with their guns and glistening bayonets. The color of the earth, the skeletal branches of the spindly trees that rose above the cookhouse roof, seemed like things in a distant dream. At last Devil stopped them with a wave of the hand. "Stop your walking now," he said, "and watch the game." One of the players took out his watch, looked at it and put it away again. He spat on the dice and threw them, 111, once more, then gathered them up. "Well, that's it," he said in mock disgust. Red lowered himself to the doorsill and swung into the Navy kitchen. Alan handed the buckets to Devil, who handed them to Bell with a bow and flourish. A guard shouted, "Break up that game." Alan started a good-natured scuffle with Fraser, who was stupidly facing the kitchen door. Tim dropped behind the screen of men and scrambled into the kitchen, cracking his shin against the sill. Red was already out of sight. Tim lost no time in rounding the boiler and kneeling with Red behind a stack of wood which was topped by towels and rags that hung from the line. Devil had built up the woodpile high and solid so that the men would have a place to hide. Tim tried to look out between the towels but Bell had hung them so that they overlapped. Bell's hand came around the boiler, and one blanket and then another tumbled over Tim's head. He drew them away, smiling in spite of himself, and shoved one toward Red. Bell whispered, "Bullheads in the courtyard now." Tim thought about the dummies. He hoped that Addison's eyes were as dull as they looked. Now Devil's voice came deep and quiet. "Don't worry. Bullhead's gone inside again. You have nothing to fear from that thick-head lout." Bell said, "The wagon came at 3:30. Auntie left some things for you. We put them in the packs." At 4:30 Addison sounded off again. Time to go back inside. Tim could hear the shuffling of the prisoners' feet and their mumbled talk. He heard the slam of the jailhouse, 112, door. Then he heard a most unwelcome sound. Sen's voice came loud and clear from somewhere in the yard. The guard was changing, and Sen was giving his sentries instructions. Tim glanced at Red's face, dimly lit behind the towels and rags. Red whispered disgustedly, "The man has no business here." "No talk," rumbled Devil. "Sen will leave soon. There. He's starting for the jailhouse now." Tim heard Sen's footsteps passing close. His boots scraped the earth by the jailhouse. The door creaked open, then clanged shut. Devil went about his work. He clanked the pots and dropped firewood and sang Navy ditties. As he always did, Bell was watching at the door, and after what seemed an eternity he turned back into the room. Nothing to worry about in the yard. The guards are as usual. It's getting dark. Tim wondered what was happening in the jail. When Devil and Belle had finished their work they hailed a guard to take them to the Navy mess. The guard came into the shack and offered to help. Well, sure you can help, said Devil hastily. Here, Belle, grab one handle of the tub of mush and let the guard help on the other side. Tim heard a scraping of feet as the men left the kitchen and he heard Devil whisper, you boys hold tight. Tim and Red sat quiet. They had no way of knowing whether a guard was near. Tim could hear someone working in the army kitchen. He couldn't remember who was cooking tonight. Devil and Belle came back to the kitchen, Devil talking all the way so that the hidden men would know who they were. Tim began to feel cramped. His legs ached and he, 113, wished he could shift his position a little. But he was afraid he might bring down the pile of wood. Devil said, it's dark enough for you to go right now, but Sen is still in there, prowling about. A few minutes later Belle said, we'll have to go back inside right soon, I'm afraid, and there'll be no noise to cover your passage through the window and the shed. Let us know when you want to take the risk. Devil finished his work and he and Belle sat around, talking as naturally as they could. Tim heard someone open the door to the yard. And Sen's voice came again, looks as if the game is up, whispered Belle. Good evening, gentlemen, said Sen. How is it you're still here? Devil said, we were talking about old times and such. Addison's voice sounded just outside. Shall I take them up? Sen stepped inside. Not just yet. The rickety floor creaked and bent. Sen kicked lightly at the pile of wood. Why in the name of common sense do you keep that much wood in here? Devil gave a hollow laugh. I like to have a lot on hand. Saves us going to the shed over and over again and bothering the guards and that. Say, Captain Sen, he said, getting to his feet, making the floor rock still more, did my money ever come from home? No. Sen cleared his throat. That wood should be taken back first thing tomorrow. You'll set this place on fire. Through a chink in the pile of logs Tim saw something move. It was one of Sen's boots. Tim stared at the polished toe as if it were the head of a rattlesnake. Then he saw it move again. Sen was going toward the door. Corporal, 114, now you can take them up. Boys, don't forget that wood. As he stepped on the sill the floorboards groaned and a piece of wood tumbled off the top of the stack. See what I mean? Said Sen. That's too much wood. Chapter 14, Come now, boys, Addison said. Tim heard one of the sailors raising the lantern glass and blowing out the flame. Now the kitchen was dark. The sailors left, the army cook was ordered into the yard and Addison summoned another guard to go with him when he took the cooks back to their quarters. It was customary for at least 2 guards to pace the courtyard all night long. The guard changed at 9 in the evening and again at 1 and 5. They usually hung a lantern by the wagon gate and one from the corner of the woodshed roof. There was also the lamp on the wall by the jailhouse door. Now in the silence Tim could hear the settling of the stove as it cooled. Red shifted his weight and the floor creaked. There was no sound from the courtyard. Tim's knees began to hurt where they pressed against the wooden floor. He twisted his shoulders to relieve the numbness in his arms. He felt for his haversack and ran his fingers over its bulging sides. He turned to Red and, 116, whispered softly, I hope the packs will go through the window. Red whispered back, I just hope we'll fit through. Then, like a pistol cocking and firing, the jailhouse door opened and slammed. Footsteps crossed the yard, and Sen spoke to one of the guards. Let me out the wagon gate and mind you fasten it well behind. Yes. Sir. When Sen had gone one of the guards said, the old boy's a worrier, sure enough. During the past few days Tim and Red had observed from their cell as the guards stood evening watch. When Addison and Sen had left, the guards usually stood together and talked by the wagon gate, or sometimes, if they thought they weren't being watched, they played a game of cards. Now that Sen had gone the guards would probably be slack in performing their duties. But if they stayed close by, It would be much worse than if they paced the yard. Tim wondered if the chance to escape might not be lost. If only they had been able to get through the window while Devil was kicking up noise. Now one of the guards was walking around the yard. He stopped not far from the cook shack and talked to the other, who must be near the woodshed door. Does that fathead corporal watch the yard? He sleeps between the change of guard. Let's play cards by the wagon gate. It's a sight warmer right here. We'd better stay by the gate in case the captain comes back that way. He wants a guard by the gate right through the night. Their footsteps sounded again as they walked to the gate. Tim's eyes were accustomed to the dark and he could, 117, see the shape of Red waiting patiently beside him. A slight yellow light behind the towels must be filtering in from the lamp by the jailhouse door. Red whispered, there may not be a better time than this. Let's go. Tim stood up slowly, listening for a sound in the yard. He faced the window and put both hands on the bricks at the bottom of the opening. The frame had been so loose that Devil had taken it out and set it in the corner beside the stove. Red straightened up and stood beside Tim, ready to help him if he could. Tim drew his elbows into his sides so that he could wiggle through the narrow space. He pulled himself off the floor, and as he did so a brick came away and went tumbling and crashing to the floor. Both men ducked. Tim could feel the thumping of his heart as he listened for the guards. One of them said, "What was that?" "There's nobody in the yard but us. Must be outside. We better look around." Footsteps sounded close and the woodshed door creaked. Nothing here. Lanternlight flashed in the door of the Navy kitchen. Tim could hear the hissing of the dying embers in the stove. A voice sounded loud. "No sign of anyone in here. Must have been outside." The guards looked into the army kitchen and went back to the wagon gate. Tim felt again and found that the wall was rotten all around the window. The mortar had dried and crumbled. One by one he loosened the bricks and handed them to Red, who set them in a pile on the floor. He hoped Devil could put them back, or at least conceal the work so that other prisoners could use this route at a later time. 118. By the time Tim reached firm brick there was a gaping, ragged hole in the wall. Tim tried again, this time with a boost from Red. He scrambled up and perched in the opening. All he could see was the light of a lantern burning slits of yellow through the cracks in the boards of the shed wall. One of the guards said, "You wouldn't try to cheat on me?" The other guard laughed. "Cheat you? Hell, Randy, you know I'm not a cheatin' man." Tim scrambled across and stepped blindly onto the pile of wood. There was a rumble as the pieces settled but his foot held firm. He waited again, listening. The guards kept chattering about their game, and Tim felt around with his other foot. He looked back through the opening. Red's face was white and still, then it disappeared and appeared again. He handed the blankets through, then the packs. Tim reached for them one at a time and threw them gently so they came to rest by the missing board. Then Red came through. He was bigger around than Tim, and somehow his blouse got caught on the edge of the ragged opening. He tried to move forward but the brass buttons on the front of his blouse were caught fast. Tim grasped Red's shoulders and felt a kind of rhythmic pulsing motion. Red was shaking with uncontrollable mirth. "You madman," Tim whispered in Red's ear. "You'll give the show away." Tim kept his hands on Red's shoulders until the shaking stopped. Red wriggled free and eased himself to the pile of wood. Tim felt for the fence. His hand ran swiftly across the boards, but they all seemed firm. He gave the middle one, 119, a smack with the flat of his hand, and it hinged outward with a sudden creak. A guard said, "Someone's stirring in the alley yonder. Maybe we should take a look." "You're as bad as Captain Sen. What happens outside is none of our worry. What's got into you tonight?" There was a mumbled answer. Tim worked himself around and stuck his head out into the alley. He looked along the jailhouse wall toward the front of the jail. A feeble light from one of the windows struck the worn cobbles and dry grass. There was no one in sight. Slowly he worked his way around and looked the other way, not daring to pry the board up farther. A row of houses faced the back of the jail, lamplight showing in some of their windows. No one was in the street at the back, as far as Tim could tell. He pried the board upward, crawled into the alley, and reached back for the blankets and haversacks. Then he held the board up so that Red could come through. For a moment both men crouched in the alley beside the fence. Then they slipped their haversacks over their shoulders and folded their blankets over their arms. Tim grabbed the end of the board, and ever so slowly put it back, setting the points of the nails in the holes and shoving them in as best he could. The two men straightened up at last. Tim could feel the blood working into the numbness of his legs and arms. The night was chilly but the air was clear. They headed toward the back of the jail yard, going quietly so that they could pass the card players without being heard. When they reached the corner of the fence, Tim looked, 120, cautiously south, then north. He gave a sign that the street was clear and crossed with Red at his side. The railroad ran a block or so east, just beyond the gardens at the back of the houses that faced the jail. The men dodged into an alley between two of the houses and found their path blocked by a shaft of lamplight coming from the first-floor window of the house on their right. The light marked a yellow rectangle on the clapboard wall of the other house. Tim was about to duck the window and move into the garden at the back when a dog started barking behind the house. They waited quietly against the wall until the barking stopped, then retraced their steps. The street was still deserted, so they walked north at a moderate pace. Turning to the left at the end of the block, rounding the corner of a darkened house and heading for the railroad track. The dog started barking again, and their impatience got the better of them. They ran along the side street, scrambled across the track and down the embankment and headed north. The track passed through a thinly settled part of town, and as they moved Tim felt a sudden exhilaration. Now it seemed unlikely that they would be seen before they had gained the shelter of the woods. The stars gleamed bright between moving clouds. Now the embankment had disappeared and the ties lay on the ground, not sunken as they sometimes were. The men walked beside the rails, through a grove of trees, and, without the slightest warning, came on a tumble-down shack. A good-sized dog was chained to a tree close by the shack and he barked and growled as if the devil was clawing at his throat. Tim and Red moved right along, but the door of the shack swung wide and a man stood. Big and silent, silhouetted in the light. Tim stopped and raised his hand. "Good evening," he said. "Sorry to pass so close." The man didn't answer and Tim turned to go. A voice boomed out above the snarling of the dog. "Come here, Yankees." They turned and faced the door. Tim hesitated, then moved toward the light. The fellow was a Negro. His skin was dark as ebony. He looked as if he could break a man in two with a flick of his wrist. He half turned toward the menacing dog. "Hush!" he rasped. Then he cocked his head. "I see I was right." Tim looked straight at the man but didn't speak. Now the colored man rumbled, "I should turn you back. But I don't care a damn for this war." He lowered his head like an angry bull. "I don't trust any man, white or black. Get out." Tim started to speak, but the big man moved his hand through the air in front of his eyes as if he were pushing aside a rock. He raised his voice. "Get out." As they moved away Tim shivered. His spirits sank. The encounter had seemed an ill omen. Off to the left the river glistened in the starlight. As they walked beside the track they crossed a highway at the edge of town and finally gained the shelter of the woods. Now the river ran close to the track and they could hear the sound of water against the rocks. As their eyes grew accustomed to the starlight they saw dashes of white where the river flowed by little islands and around the rocks. They passed through thickets of dark undergrowth and crossed little streams that trickled and bubbled on the way to the river's edge. The air seemed incredibly clear and the landscape fresh and sweet. They mounted a hill and, 123, stood for a moment at the top, looking back. The lights of the city winked in the distance, but there was no sign of pursuit. They rolled their blankets and tied them around the tops of their haversacks. As they turned to go forward again the sound of a church bell came to their ears, a sound they had heard through the silent, sultry nights of summer, the cool nights of fall. It carried with it the memory of months of imprisonment. Tim drew in his breath, and Red spun around and led the way down the hill as if his house was in view, his wife and son waiting in the doorway. They walked on level ground beside the track for an hour or so, then down a gentle slope. At a point where the river cut close to the track the ground grew soft, and they stepped across the rails and walked from tie to tie. The ties were spaced so that walking was difficult, and they were thinking of trying the ground again when they found themselves on a rickety trestle that shook as they walked. Red went more slowly now. He stumbled and caught himself. "Watch that one, it's rotten," he said in an unsteady voice, "take it slow. This trestle can't be long. There's no sound of water. There's nothing but swamp down there. We can thank our stars the trains are few and far between." Ahead of them the track disappeared into the gloom. The trestle stretched on, and they walked until they lost all sense of time. Red stopped from time to test a tie that he imagined might be weaker than the rest. It was clear he didn't like the work. Once he tried to look at his watch, but he couldn't see the hands and the matches were in one of the haversacks. 124, they must have broken out of jail at 6:30 or 7. Tim couldn't imagine what time it might be now. It seemed they had walked this trestle since the dawn of creation. Tim noticed the signs of exhaustion in himself. He felt inclined to stagger, and he knew he might fall headlong into the gulf below. "Stop a moment," he said. "Let's rest." Red's shoulders slumped. He turned slowly and sat on one of the rails, with one boot on a tie and the other dangling. "How soft we are. Walking these ties would tire a coolie." Tim ached in every joint and muscle. He wanted to stretch out on a tie and go to sleep. "We'd better move on soon," he said. "We have to find cover by dawn." Red laughed dryly. "It all seemed such a lark when we sat in the jail and made the plans." Tim stood up and edged around to take the lead. He tried the next tie with his foot, and they moved on again, stepping as before, each time with an awkward little hop. They hadn't gone 500 feet when the trestle ended and the track reached firm ground again. They moved into another wood, jogged down a slope and jumped across a rushing stream. They traveled through the night, moving from lowland to higher ground and back to lowland again, crossing half a dozen trestles shorter than the first. They stopped just short of another wood and faced each other and realized that now there was light. Red swayed, his back to the rosy glow in the eastern sky. His face was haggard, his eyes were sunken. He blinked and shook his head and turned to look back.